Hey everyone, this is Rob with Code Academy. I'm a software developer based out of Seattle, Washington. In this video, we're going to walk through the React Capstone project, jamming. To complete this project, you'll need to be familiar with how to use JSX and basic React syntax, how to pass information between React components using props, how to manage component data with React State, and how to interact with a third-party API. This is a long project and a long video, but I've included some timestamps by step. And if you click through to this video on YouTube and look in the video description, you can hop straight there. In our jamming project, we're going to build a React web application called jamming. We're going to take our knowledge of React components, passing state, and request with the Spotify API to build a website that allows users to search the Spotify library, create custom playlists, then save it to their own Spotify account. You can click on this link to see what our final project is going to look like. We have a search bar where we can enter in the name of a song, a band, or an artist. So I'm just going to type in James Taylor. And then when we hit search, we get our results on the left-hand side of the screen. We return the name of a song, the artist, and the album that it comes from. So if we want to add this song to a playlist that we're going to create, we just click the plus sign. And we can see that as we do that, those songs appear on the right-hand side of the screen. Now what we can also do is we can choose the name of our playlist. So I can call this James Taylor Hits. And then we click the Save to Spotify button. Now the first time a user attempts to save a playlist to their Spotify account, there will be some login information that's needed. And we'll walk through that as we go through the project. And one other thing to note is that when we do start to add songs to a playlist, if we find that we accidentally added a song that we didn't want to, we should be able to hit this subtraction sign or minus sign to remove the song before we choose to save it. Now we've broken the jamming project down into 13 sections. Each section will contain a descriptive header with an introductory step followed by a set of steps that guide you to the outcome. The first step of each section will explain the goal and provide a brief overview of how we'll accomplish it. And before you start the second step, try and plan how you would complete the section yourself. This is a great place to start to use some problem-solving skills and think of how you would approach a problem as you compare it with the steps that we suggest. And while this is a long project, we're going to be with you every step of the way. Let's go ahead and get started. Our first section will be creating a React application. By the end of this section, you'll be ready to start building your website. This section walks you through the process of setting up the directory structure and adding CSS presets. We'll begin by creating a boilerplate React app, removing unused files, and adding a reset.css file. We'll also work on including a couple Google fonts and an updated favicon. So let's mark step 1 as complete, and on to step 2. Let's create a new React application in a directory called jamming. Okay, so I'm in my terminal, and if I do a pwd, print working directory, we can see that I'm in a directory I created called jamming. You can make this repository anywhere you want on your computer. Now we'll go ahead and use create React app to create our app. And I'll go ahead and name mine jamming as well. Alright, so we finished creating our app with create React app. And if I do an ls, I can see that there is our app that has been created. So I'm going to go ahead and cd into that. And then to start our app, we'll just type in npm start. And we can see in our terminal that this is running at localhost 3000. And there it is. So we have our React app up and running. This is some boilerplate material that's in the Create React app, already displaying content for us. So let's go ahead and mark step 2 as complete. And we'll go ahead and move on to step 3. In whatever text editor you want to use, go ahead and open up the jamming directory containing your Create React app code. We're going to begin by going to the index.html file in the public folder. And we want to update the title value to jamming. So we'll go to our title tag. This is in our index.html file, and we'll change this to jamming. Now if we save our code, and if we go to our app that's running, I'll go ahead and minimize the screen, and we can see that we changed the name of our app to jamming in our tab. So let's mark step 3 as complete, and we'll move on to step 4. we want to remove the app.test.js file and the logo.svg file. So this is going to be in our src source directory, and we can click on app.test.js, and if we control click or right click, we can go ahead and delete that. And we also want to delete our logo.svg file as well. Now when we do that, if we go to look at our app that was running in the browser, it is now broken because we removed our logo.svg file. So let's go ahead and fix that. If I do a search in Visual Studio Code and I type in logo.svg, I can see that in our app.js file, we were trying to import this. So if I go to line 2, I'm going to remove the line that says import logo from logo.svg. And when we save our code, we can see that this still doesn't fix the problem, because on line 8, we were actually trying to use that logo. So let's look at line 8, and we can see that we have an image tag that we were trying to bring in this logo image. So I'm going to go ahead and remove that as well. And then when we save our code, we can see that our app is back up and running again. Okay, let's mark step 4 as complete. And we'll move on to step 5. We're going to add reset.css to the public directory and link it to the index.html file. So when you click on that link, we get our CSS reset. And we're going to go back to our public directory. And in VS Code, you can right-click on this public folder to create a new file. Or there's this icon up top that you can click on right here to create a new file as well. So we can call this reset.css. And we'll paste in all this code. And the reason that we're doing this is because different browsers have some different baked-in styling. And so we want to make sure that our app appears in different browsers the same way. So now let's go ahead and link to this in our index.html file. This is a style sheet, and as we're in the same directory, we can just do ./reset.css. And I'm also going to add right here type equals to text/CSS. So now if you save your code, if you do go back to look at your app, you probably won't see much of a difference, but this ensures that as we look at this in different browsers, we'll have the same visual results. Alright, so let's go ahead and mark step 5 as complete, and we'll move on to step 6. In step 6, we want to link the following Google fonts in index.html. If you'd like, you could go ahead and open these up in a new tab, and we could take a look at the specifics of these fonts. But to actually bring them into our app, all we have to do is right-click on them, and we can copy the link address. And then we're going to go to the index.html file again, and we can link to these fonts. So link and href. This is where we'll paste in that link that you just copied. So that was our Poppins font. Let's go ahead now and copy the link to the Work Sans font. So again, a link tag with an href to the link that we copied. The relationship again is going to be style sheet. Awesome. So we got step 6 marked as complete. Let's go ahead and move on to step 7. We want to update the favicon.ico file with this image. We can see that Create React App gives us this standard React icon, and we want to replace this with an icon of our own. So you can go ahead and click on this link, and then what I would do to make this as smooth as possible is you can just go ahead and save the image as, and I'm going to save it as favicon.ico, and I'll hit save. And then wherever that folder is, you can go ahead and drag it from the folder that you saved it to into this public folder, and it will override the favicon.ico file that was already there. So now we can see that we have a favicon image that we like. Alright, we just finished the first section, and now we can go ahead and move on to the second section. create static components. Alright, so in this second section of building our app, we're going to create the JavaScript file and CSS file for each of the 6 components we're going to need in our jamming app. In the steps below, we're going to link to the raw HTML templates and CSS to help you write the JSX for each component. In the HTML, we're going to use comments to indicate where the JSX for one component renders another component, and we're going to walk through the implementation of each component from the templates provided in future steps. So let's go ahead and make sure that step 8 is marked complete, and we'll move on to step 9. So now I'm going to click on the source folder, and we can either right-click it or click this folder icon to create a new directory. We're going to call this components, as this is going to hold our 6 components that we're going to create. Now within this components directory, if we look at step 10, I'll mark step 9 complete, we want to create a directory called app. And we're going to move the app.js and app.css file that already exist into this directory, and then we're going to update the path in the index.js file accordingly. And additionally, we're going to want to add this background to the directory as well, as we're going to use it in the CSS file. So let's get started. Within our components directory, we'll create a directory called app. And we want to drag in our app.css file and our app.js file as well. And then we want to update our path in our index.js file. Because if we look at our page now, we'll see that our code has failed to compile, because we no longer know where to find the app.js file. So in index.js, we want to look at line 4 where we are importing app. And so if we look at the file structure, I'm going to go ahead and close this app directory so this is a little bit more clear. From index.js, we are first reaching into the components directory. So this should be components. Then we're looking at the app directory that we created, and then we're looking at the app.js file. So we'll type in app one more time. The components folder is where we're looking first, then the app folder or directory, and then finally our app.js file. So if you save your code, we should see that our code is now compiling as we would expect. Now our last step is we wanted to add that background image to the directory as well. I'm going to go ahead and save it as this background underscore photo underscore desktop. And so wherever you save that file, you can go ahead and just drag it into the app directory. Awesome, great job. Okay, we can go ahead and mark step 10 as complete. Let's go ahead and move on to step 11. We're going to begin working in our app.js file on our app component. And we're going to want to render the following HTML. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this code. And then I'm going to go to our app.js file. And we're going to go ahead and rewrite this as a class component, as we'll be using state as we go through building our project. So the syntax is class app extends react.component, and then we use the render method, and then we want to return the code that was linked to. And I'll go ahead and clean up this format in just a moment. But we can see that we have some comments in HTML, where we want to add a search bar component, add a search results component, and add a playlist component. Now, if you were to save your code, you would actually find that this breaks your app, because what is a valid comment in HTML is not a valid comment in JSX. So let's go ahead and add our components. Search bar. And then next we want to go ahead and we want to add a search results component. And then finally we want to add a playlist component. All right, perfect. Now our next step is we want to change all of our class attributes to class name. All right, so these should be the 3 locations that we do that. If you don't change these from class to class name, it won't break your app, but you will find a warning in the console. Now if we look at our page, we'll see that it has still failed to compile because we've attempted to add components that so far don't exist. So let's go ahead for now and let's just comment these out. On a Mac, I just do this with a command and / in Visual Studio Code. And as you're going through this project, if you're trying to figure out how to do any shortcuts in VS Code, you can simply go down to this cog button in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen, and then you can click on Keyboard Shortcuts. And when you do that, you'll see a lot of shortcuts that are available to you. They're ones that I'll take advantage as we go through this project. So I could just type in comment, and I can see that this command / that I just used is the toggle line comment. And that's what comments out a whole line at once, or uncomments a line at once as well. So if I'm taking any shortcuts and you don't remember how I did them, just remember to click on this cog in the bottom left-hand side of the screen and click the Keyboard Shortcuts button, and you'll see what shortcuts are available to you. So now if we've saved our code after commenting out those components that we aren't using yet, we'll find that our code is compiling. And currently we just see this text jamming on the screen, plain white screen with some black text. This is what we'd expect so far. Alright, step 11 is complete. In our app.js, we converted our component to a class component, and we added a render method that returned HTML that we converted to valid JSX. We changed the class attribute to class name. And then we can see that we also accomplished step 12. We used the comments in the HTML document from the last step to determine the components that we needed to import into app.js. Now one thing to note in step 12. We're going to create a folder for each component. The JavaScript file and the CSS files for each component will live in the components folder. The folder, JavaScript file, and CSS file will all have the same name. This is a really good practice that will help you keep your code organized. Okay, with step 12 complete, let's go ahead and move on to step 13. We're going to add this CSS to the app.css file, and then we're going to import app.css into app.js. So first I'm going to get all this code, and then in our text editor, I'm going to go to the app.css file, or I'm going to highlight all of this code, and then paste in our new code. Now if we go to our app.js file, we can see that we've actually imported in the app.css file, so we don't have to do anything further in this circumstance. But when we create our future components, that'll be a practice that we'll need to remember to do each time. So now with our code saved, we can see that we've added a lot of styling to our app. And this background image will take up the full screen as we fill out the rest of the components in our app. Okay, so we can go ahead and mark step 13 as complete, and we'll move on to step 14. We're going to go ahead and create a search bar directory in the components directory, and then inside of search bar, we're going to add a searchbar.js file and a searchbar.css file. So in our components directory, I'm going to add a folder, and I'll call this search bar. And then within this directory, I'm going to add a file, and we'll call this searchbar.js. And then another file, searchbar.css. Now remember our pattern of organizing code. Every component is going to have a folder with a standard name such as searchbar, a CSS file with the same name, searchbar.css, and a JS file with the same name, searchbar.js. Again, this will be a really helpful way to organize our code and be able to reference our code as we need to. So now back to our steps, we can mark step 14 as complete and move on to step 15. Inside of searchbar.js, we're going to create a component called searchbar with a render method that returns this HTML. And again, we're going to follow the guidelines that we followed before. We're going to change class attributes to class name, and we'll use the comments in the HTML document to determine if you need to import any components. And then finally, we want to export the search bar component. So let's get started with this HTML. I'll copy this code. And then in our searchbar.js file that we created, we first want to create a class component. So we're going to import React from React. And then just so we don't forget, we're going to go ahead and import in our searchbar.css file. So because it's in the same directory, we can do // and then name searchbar.css. This way we'll have access to all the styling that we need for this component. Now to build our class component, we'll say class searchbar. And this is going to be common that your component name is going to be the same name as the file as we go through this project. Extends react.component. And then within the render method, we want to go ahead and return the following HTML. Now remember, our next step is to change class to class name. And we can see this in two places. Looks like we have a little misspelling here of class with two A's. We'll make that class name. And then finally, we want to export our component. If we don't do this, this will create an error as the rest of our app won't have access to this component. So export default search bar. And we'll follow this process for all the components that we create. So even if this is new to you, you should have this syntax down as we do this again and again as we go through each of our components. So now that we've created our JS file, let's start to work on our CSS file. We can mark step 15 as complete and on to step 16. We'll add the following CSS to the searchbar.css file. And again, if you haven't done it yet, you'll want to import searchbar.css into searchbar.js. So we'll grab our styling and we'll go to searchbar.css and save our code. Now at this point, if we go to our app, we'll see that nothing has happened. The first reason for this is because we have our search bar component commented out. So let's go back to app.js and we'll go to our search bar and we'll uncomment it. Now I'm going to save it and I'm just going to give you a warning right away. This is going to create an error. We can see that in the app.js file, that search bar is not defined. So let's look at line 10. On line 10, we have search bar that we're trying to render, but it's not defined. This is because we haven't imported it in at the top of the screen. So if we just say import search bar from, and now we need to follow the file structure to get to this file. So if we look at where we're at, we want to go up a directory because we're not in the same directory. So we can do that with // and then we want to look in the search bar directory. And then within the search bar directory, we want the search bar file. And we don't have to put JS at the end as React knows exactly what we're trying to do. So now if we take a look at our code, we can see that it is rendered as we would expect. So now I'm going to go ahead and open up React DevTools. So if you open up your console, if it doesn't show up right away, it should probably be behind two right arrows. And I'm using Google Chrome and their Chrome DevTools. So I'll click on React, and we can start to look at our project. We have our app component, and then we can now see our search bar component as well. And we'll continually open up these React DevTools to look at how our code and our data is moving from a parent component to a child component. We will routinely use these React DevTools to see how data and actions are flowing within our project. Alright, so we can go ahead and mark step 16 as complete, and now on to step 17. We'll next create a search results directory in the components directory, and inside of that directory we're going to add a search results.js file and a search results.css file. So we'll make sure that we're in the components directory, and we'll create a directory called search results. And inside of that directory, we want to add a file called search results.js, and then another file called search results.css. And we're going to follow the same flow in step 18. You're going to add the HTML that's linked to, you're going to change all the class attributes to class name. We're going to look at the comments in the HTML document to determine if you need to import any components, and then you're going to export the search results component. So inside of search results.js, we're going to import React from React, we're also going to import in the CSS. So remember, this is in the same directory, so /search results.css. Next, we want to create a class component of search results. So class search results extends react.component, and then within the render method, we want to return the HTML that was linked to. And so we can see that we have an HTML comment to add a track list component. This is what we'll build in a few moments. So track list, and then we'll get rid of that comment and save our code. And then the last step we want to make sure is we export default search results. So we can mark step 17 as complete and also step 18. Now let's go ahead and move on to step 19, where we want to add CSS to the search results.css file. So go ahead and make sure that you've copied that code that's linked to, and then search results.css, we'll just paste that code in. Now if we go back to app.js, we can go to our search results component and uncomment it out. We also have to remember to import search results from, and this is going to be one directory up in our search results directory, and we're looking at the search results.js file. So if we save our code, we might expect that it will now run. However, we're going to run into an error. We find that in our search results.js file, our component, that track list is not defined. So if we go to search results.js, we'll go to this track list component, and for now I'm just going to comment it out. And that gets our page up and going. So in our search results component, if you remember, it has an h2 of results, and then a track list component that we've commented out, and this is our styling that we imported into our component. Alright, we can mark step 19 as complete, and we'll move on to step 20. We're going to create a playlist directory in the components directory, and inside of that playlist directory, we're going to add playlist.js and playlist.css. Okay, so we'll go to our components directory. We'll create a directory called playlist. Then we're going to add a file called playlist.js, and then also playlist.css. Okay, that's all for step 20. We'll mark that as complete. And then for step 21, we're going to follow the same process that we've done before. We're going to render this HTML. We're going to change class attributes to class name. Then you'll notice in the HTML, we'll change the value property to default property. We'll set it equal to new playlist within opening and closing curly braces. And we'll be sure to keep track list commented out. Okay, let's get working on this step. The first thing we'll do in our playlist.js file is we will import React from React. Then we want to import in our CSS file, which is /playlist.css. And then we want to create our playlist class component. Class playlist extends react.component. And then in the render method, we want to return the following HTML. Now this comment lets us know that we want to add a track list component, and that we should also copy out this component because it's not going to work until we pass some props to it. And if you'll remember, in step 21, we need to do a little bit more work. We want to change value to default value, and we want new playlist to be within curly braces. And then finally, we want to export the playlist component. So export default playlist. All right, great job. We can mark step 21 as complete and move on to step 22, where we're going to add the CSS to the playlist.css file and make sure to import it into the JS file if you haven't done this yet. So in playlist.css, I've added the following CSS content, and if we do try to view our app, we'll see that nothing has changed yet. That's because we need to make sure that we go to app.js and we import in playlist from our playlist directory, looking at the playlist.js file. And now we can go down to the component that was commented out and we can uncomment it. So now we can save our code and we can see that our playlist component is now showing up with the text new playlist and our button that says save to Spotify. Alright, with that we have the basic skeleton of our app already built. Let's mark step 22 as complete and move on to step 23. For step 23, we're going to build a track list directory. And we're going to go ahead and add a tracklist.js file and then also a tracklist.css file. So we can mark step 23 as complete, and looking at step 24, we're going to follow our usual steps. We'll create our tracklist component that renders the following HTML. We'll change all class attributes to class name. And then we'll use the comments in the HTML document to determine if we need to import in any components. And then finally, we'll export our tracklist component. So we'll make sure we're in the tracklist.js file and we'll import React from React. Then we also want to import in our CSS. Tracklist.css. Next, we'll create our tracklist component as a class component. So class tracklist extends react.component and our render method is going to go ahead and return the following HTML. And we can see that we have a comment right here that says you will add a map method that renders a set of track components. For now, I'm going to go ahead and delete that comment so that HTML comment doesn't actually cause our code to fail to compile, but we'll keep this in mind. Now let's make sure to export default track list. So let's go ahead and mark step 24 as complete, and we'll move on to step 25. We'll add the following CSS to our tracklist.css file. So in tracklist.css, we'll go ahead and just paste this in and save our code. And we can mark step 25 as complete. Now finally, we're going to create a track directory with a track.js and a track.css file. So we'll go to our components directory, create a directory called track, and then we'll add a file within it called track.js, and then another file, track.css. So we'll mark step 26 as complete, and then finally for step 27, we'll repeat a process that we've done a few times going through this project. We'll create a component that renders in the following HTML. We'll change class attributes to class name. However, this time we're going to add a render action that displays a button with a minus or removal type symbol as its content if the isRemoval property is true. This will be a prop that's passed down, and a plus button if the isRemoval property is false. And then we'll set the class name to track action. So there's a few more steps to this than we've done in our other components so far. So let's get working on this. Let's go to our track.js file and we'll import React from React. And then let's import in our CSS file, import track.css, and then we'll create our class component. Class track extends react.component, and then within the render method, we want to go ahead and return the following HTML. We have an h3 tag with the track name. I'm going to remove what looks like these HTML comments. And if you remember, the next thing we want to do is we want to create a render action. So within our component, above our render method, we'll create a method called render action. And so we're looking for a if removal property is true. So this will be a prop that's passed down. So we'll say if this dot props dot is removal. If this is true, then we want to render a button with a negative symbol. So we'll say button, and we'll put a minus sign. If is removal is false, then we want the following code to run. Whoops, on line 9, I want to return this. And so if is removal is false, then I want to return a button with a plus sign. This logic is going to play out when a user is actually doing a search. If they search, for example, James Taylor, all the songs as a result of the search will have is removal set to false. And so we'll display a plus sign that will allow them to add whatever James Taylor song they want to their playlist that they're going to save. However, if a song has been clicked and added to the potential playlist about to be saved and you realize that you don't want it to be there, when it's in that state, is removal will actually be true and there'll be a negative sign that the user will be able to click on to remove a song. And then we want to give these a class of track action. So class name equals track action. Class name equals track action. And then we no longer need this hard-coded any longer, but we can render our method. So we can say render action, and then depending on what this props value is, we'll either display this minus button or this positive button. Now let's make sure to export default track, and we'll save our code. Now at this point, I'm not going to import this component into another component because we don't have the is removal props being passed down yet. I'm not going to worry about importing this component into another component yet. And the last thing we need to do is change our class attribute to class name. Okay, so to recap what we did, we changed class attribute to class name. Instead of a hard-coded button that was previously here, we want a dynamic button that displays a negative or a positive based on the value of the prop is removal that's going to be passed down into this component. All right, let's return to step 27 and mark it as complete and move on to step 28. We're going to add the following CSS to our track.css file. All right, we'll mark step 28 as complete. And that marks the end of section 2. In section 3, we're going to pass down search result and render result list. Okay, so in this section, we're going to pass the state of a search results parameter through a series of components to render an array of tracks. So in our app, when a user requests data from Spotify, when they search, the JSON response will include a set of song tracks. Each track will contain a name, artist, and album. And so in our jamming web app, we're going to display this song name, artist, and album as well. And then in a later section, we're going to build a method that sets the state of the search results parameter to a response from the Spotify API. For now, we're going to hard code some of that data in this section. So let's mark step 29 as complete and get started with implementing this in step 30. We're going to add a constructor function to the app component and pull in props from the React component class. So we'll go to our app.js file and we'll add a constructor function. Now this goes above the render, and the syntax, if we remember, is the constructor keyword. Then we pass in props, and then we call super props. This will be standard as we start to add state to our components going through this project. So we can mark step 30 as done, And in step 31, inside of the app component, we're going to set some initial state. And if you take a look at the hint, we're going to see that the value of this.state.searchResults is going to be an array, and each array is going to contain an object. And each object will have the properties name, artist, album, and ID with values that we hardcode for now. So let's go ahead and do this. This is going to be inside of our constructor method. We'll say this.state, and we'll set it equal to an empty object. In our state object, we want a property called search results. And we're going to set this to a value of an array containing objects that have the properties name, artist, album, and ID. So we'll do our first object, name, and I'll set this equal to a string of name1. I'm going to keep this really generic just because we're hard coding our data right now. Then we have an artist property, and I'm just going to set this to the string artist1. We have an album property, which I'll set to the string album1. And then we have an ID property that I'll set to 1. Okay, so we have one whole object with our 4 properties. I'm going to go ahead and copy that, and I'm going to add a comma to separate this object from our next object. And I'll just change these 1s to 2s. You could be more creative as you're hard coding your data, but just to make this as straightforward as possible, I'm just going to go with this approach. So I'll go ahead and just do this one more time. We'll have name 3, artist 3, album 3, and ID 3. All right, we can go back to step 31 and mark this as complete. Now on to step 32. We want to pass the state of the app component's search results to the search results component. So we'll go to app.js, and we're going to look at our search results component, and we want to pass this.state.searchResults into our search results component. So let's go ahead and create an attribute. I'm going to go ahead and just call this search results, and we'll set it equal to, and we need to use curly braces, this.state.searchResults. Let's go ahead and confirm that we've passed down our state into our search results component. If we take a look at our app on the web at localhost 3000, if we open it up and we go to React DevTools, we can make sure that we've clicked on our app component, and we see that our app has a state. We have a property of search results, an array of 3 items. Each item is an object, and we can look at our first object at index of 0. We have properties of album, artist, ID, and name, and values for each of them. Now, if we want to confirm that our state was passed down, we can click on our search results component. And we see that our search component now has props. So search results, our prop search results is an array with 3 items containing all 3 of our objects. So it looks like we're passing down our data as we would expect. Let's mark step 32 as complete and move on to step 33. We want to pass the search results from the search results component to the track list component. So let's go to search results.js, and we have our track list component. In our track list component, we'll go ahead and use the attribute tracks, and we'll set it equal to this.props.searchResults. So we want to go ahead and pass the search results from the search results component to the track list component. I'm going to go ahead and do that. In our search results.js file, we'll name this attribute tracks and set it equal to this.props.searchResults. And then we want to make sure to import tracklist from the tracklist repository, looking specifically at the tracklist.js file. And so just to confirm that we've passed this down as we would expect, let's go back to our app, and we can see that in our app component, we have our state as we would expect. And then within search results, we've passed down our search results as a property that's available. And then if we click on track list, we can see that our props are available in our track list component as well. All right, great job. Let's go ahead and mark step 33 as complete. Now for step 34, in the track list component, we're going to use the map method to render each track in the tracks property. And then we're going to set the key attribute to track.id. So let's go ahead and put this into action. We'll go to our tracklist.js component. First, I'm going to add some opening and closing curly braces so we can gain access to our props, and say this.props.tracks. And then we're going to use the map method. And so if we remember, this.props.tracks is an array with 3 objects, and each object has 4 properties. So for each item that we're mapping over, I'm going to go ahead and call track singular, then use a fat arrow function. And what I want to do is I want to return the track component. And so for each item in our this.props.tracks array, so each object, I want to return a track component, and I'm going to pass down through the attribute track. I could call this whatever I want, but track is a good descriptive term. And I'll set track equal to track. So this will get the whole object, the song name, the album, the artist, and the ID. And then React is going to want a key. So I'll set key equal to track.id. So in the case of our 3 hard-coded objects, we have an ID of 1, ID of 2, ID of 3. So I'm going to go ahead and save this code, and I'm going to go back to our app, and we can see that our page is not compiling because track is not yet defined. We see this on line 11. So here's line 11. We're trying to render their track component, which we haven't defined yet. So we'll import track from, and we'll look at the track.js file. We are rendering the hard-coded data specifically within our track component. So we're going to want to update that with our hard-coded data that we put in our state in app.js and are attempting to pass down. But first, I just want to do a quick check to make sure that within our search results, track list, and track component that we're receiving a prop of track, which we are. Okay, so now let's go ahead and go back to our code and touch up a couple things. We'll go to track.js, and we no longer need track name to be hard-coded. We want this.props.track.name for the song. Then for the artist, we want this.props.track.artist. And then for the album, we want this.props.track.album. So now if we save our code, and we go back to our app, we can see that our results are name 1, artist 1, album 1, name 2, artist 2, album 2. And we can track the data flow from the very beginning. In app, we have an array with our 3 objects. If we open up this first one, album 1, artist 1, name 1, which matches our content here, and so on for our second and third object. All right, great job. We can go ahead and mark step 34 and 35 as complete as we finished up section 3. Next, in section 4, we're going to pass down playlist to track list. You're going to pass the state of a user's custom playlist title and tracks from the app component down to the components that render them. So when a user adds songs from a search result list to their playlist, a method will update the state of a playlist parameter in app.js, and jamming will render the song in the user's playlist. In a later assessment, you're going to write methods that add and remove songs from the playlist. You will also write a method that updates the playlist title as well. So let's mark step 36 as complete. Now that we know what this section is about, and let's move on to step 37. We're going to add hard-coded values for playlist name and playlist tracks to state in app.js. So we'll go to our app component, and we're going to go to state. So after our search results property, we're going to create a property. We'll call this playlist name, and you can set this to any string. I'm just going to go ahead and call this my playlist. And then we want another property, which is going to be playlist tracks. And this again is going to be an array of objects, each containing name, artist, album, and ID, similar to what we did above. So I'm going to copy one of these objects, And I'm going to paste it in. Switch this to playlist name 1, playlist artist 1, and playlist album 1. And I'm going to change this ID to 4 just so we don't have any matching IDs. And then I'm going to copy this object and I'm going to add a comma and add in this object again, one more comma, and paste in this object one more time. And then in our second object, I'm going to change name 1 to name 2, artist 1 to 2, album 1 to 2, ID to 5, and so on. Okay, so we can go ahead and mark step 37 as complete. And in step 38, we're going to pass the playlist name and tracks from the app component to the playlist component. So we're going to find our playlist component, and we want to pass in our playlist name and our playlist tracks. So we'll be able to do this with this.state.playlist and this.state.playlist tracks. So I'm going to add an attribute called playlist name, and I'm going to go ahead and set it to this.state.playlist name, and then also an attribute called playlist tracks. And I'm going to go ahead and set this equal to this.state.playlist tracks. And then I want to confirm that I passed this data on as I would expect. Then I'm going to go to the React Dev Tools, and I can see that in app, we've added our state of playlist name and playlist tracks. And if we click on our playlist component, we see that playlist name has been passed in as a prop set to my playlist, and playlist tracks have been passed in as a prop set to an array of 3 objects. All right, perfect. Let's go ahead and mark step 38 as complete. And for step 39, we're just going to pass playlist tracks from the playlist component to the track list component. So let's head back to our code. And we'll find our playlist component. And we can uncomment this out. And we'll add an attribute tracks. And we'll set it equal to this.props.playlist tracks. Now that we're trying to render track list, we got to make sure that we define it. So import track list from, and we'll look at the tracklist.js file. Okay, now we'll save our code and go ahead and take a look at our app. And we can see that we have hard-coded search results values that we had previously. And if we scroll down, we can see that within our playlist component, that our track list component is now displaying our playlist tracks. We've passed down that data all the way from the state that we set in playlist tracks down to the track list component. All right, great job. Let's go ahead and mark step 39 as complete. And we'll move on to section 5, adding tracks to a playlist. In this section, you want to implement a process for adding a song from the search results track to the user's custom playlist. If we look at our app, if we click on the plus sign, nothing happens. You'll also notice that there is no negative sign here on new playlist side of things as we would expect, because we haven't passed in our props for isRemove yet. We'll do that in a later action step. So we'll implement a process for adding a song from the search results track to the user's custom playlist. We're going to add a method to app.js called addTrack. That's going to add a song to the playlist state. The application passes the method through a series of components down to track. The user can trigger the addTrack method by clicking the plus sign from the search results list. Okay, now that we know what our task is for this section, let's mark step 40 as complete and move on to step 41. In our app.js file, we're going to create a method called addTrack with the following functionality. It accepts a track as an object. We'll use the track's ID property to check if the current song is in the playlist track state. If the ID is new, we'll add the song to the end of the playlist, and then we'll set a new state of the playlist. Okay, so let's go to our app.js file. And above our render method, we're going to create a method called addTrack. Now this is going to accept a track argument. So a track is going to be an object with a name, an artist, an album, an ID, and so on. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a variable called tracks. And I'm going to set this equal to this.state.playlist tracks. So tracks is going to be equal to this array of objects. And again, each object has a name, artist, album, and ID. And we're going to pay specific attention to the ID property. So we're going to say if, we're going to check if the ID is new. So we'll say if tracks, this is an array of object, and we can use the find method to accomplish this. So we'll say saved track, we can call this X, but we'll call it saved track because I feel like that's a pretty good descriptive term. So if saved track.id is equal to track.id, so that means our track that we're attempting to pass in, if its ID matches an ID that's already in our tracks array, then we're simply going to return out of this function and not do anything. However, if it isn't, if that track's ID doesn't already belong to our playlist tracks, then we'll say tracks.push and we'll add our track. Then finally, we just want to set the new state of the playlist. So we'll say this.setState is equal to, and then we'll pass in an object, playlist tracks, and we'll set that to our array of objects. Okay, let's go ahead and mark step 41 is complete. Now for our next step, we want to bind the current value of this to add track, and then we want to pass add track to the search results component as an onAdd attribute. So this is a couple of steps. The first thing we want to do is go to our constructor function, and after this.state, we'll say this.add track is equal to this.add track.bind this. And this syntax should be familiar to you from earlier interactive lessons, and there'll be quite a few times as we're building out this app that will implement this syntax. Now we want to pass this method to the search results component as an onAdd attribute. So in search results, we'll pass in an onAdd attribute and set it equal to this.add track. So I'm going to go ahead and save the code. And then I want to go to our app and I'll open up the React Dev Tools. It's always great to check this step by step as you're building so you don't get too far along before you realize that you've made a mistake. And so if I go down to our search results component, we can see that we have an onAdd prop bound to our add track method. Let's mark step 42 as complete and move on to step 43. We want to pass onAdd from the search results component to the track list component. We also want to pass an attribute isRemoval with the value of false down to track list. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll go to our search results.js file and to our track list component as an onAdd attribute, we'll pass in this.props.onAdd. This is our method that we just created. And then we also want to create an attribute of isRemoval and pass in a value of false. Now let's go ahead and confirm that we've passed down our data as we would expect. If we look at track list, we can see that we have a props of isRemoval, false, and a prop of onAdd bound to our add track method. Okay, so let's go ahead and mark step 43 as complete. And let's move on to step 44. We want to finally pass onAdd from the tracklist component to the track component. So we'll go to our tracklist.js file, and we'll pass in an onAdd attribute and set it equal to this.props.onAdd. So let's go ahead and confirm that. From app, down to search results, down to track list, down to track, we have a property of onAdd that's now available, bound to our add track method. All right, so let's go ahead and mark step 44 as complete, and we'll take a look at step 45. Okay, so for step 45, we're going to create an add track method in the track component, and we're going to use it to add this.props.track to the playlist. So above our render method, I'm going to create an add track method, and I'm going to use it to add this.props.track to the playlist. So we'll do that by first saying this.props.onAdd. This is that method that we created and passed down, and we're going to pass in this.props.track. And remember, that's going to check if this track that we're trying to add has an ID that already exists within our current playlist. If it does, it won't be added. If it doesn't, it will be pushed onto our playlist and our state will be updated. So we can go ahead and mark step 45 as complete. And now we're going to go ahead and add a constructor to the track component. We're going to call superprops in the constructor method. Then we're going to bind this.addTrack to the current value of this in the constructor method. So like I said, we'll be doing this a number of times. Constructor props, and then we'll call super props, and this dot add track is going to be equal to this dot add track dot bind this. Now we'll mark step 46 complete, and the last step we're going to do in this section is step 47. In the track.js file, on the button element that has the plus symbol, we're going to add an onClick property with the value set to this.addTrack. So on the button with the plus symbol, we're going to add the onClick property. So whenever there's a click on this button, we're going to call this.addTrack. So let's save our code, and let's go ahead and test it out. When I click on this plus sign for name 1, we see it show up in our new playlist. When I click on name 2, we see it show up in our new playlist. If we open up our React Developer Tools, we can see that our playlist tracks state, which was an array of 3 items, now is an array of 5 items, or 5 objects. If we click on another item, it shows up in our playlist tracks array. So our state is being updated successfully. All right, great job in this section. We'll mark 47 as complete. Okay, so in section 6, we want to remove tracks from a playlist. So if we look at our app, we might find we're in a situation where we added a song to our playlist that we didn't want to. Currently, if we click on the plus symbol, we're not able to remove these items. In fact, you're going to get an error at this point if you try to. So in this section, these plus signs will be changed to negatives, and we're going to create a function that will allow us to remove these songs from a playlist. Let's get started. So as I said, in this section, we're going to implement a process that removes a song from a user's custom playlist when the user selects the minus sign inside of the rendered track. So in app.js, step 49, we're going to create a method called removeTrack with the following functionality. It's going to accept a track argument, much like our addTrack method did. We're going to use the track's ID property to filter it out of the playlist tracks, and then we're going to set the new state of the playlist. So let's head to our app.js file, and underneath addTrack, removeTrack. And it's going to take a track parameter or argument, and here we're going to track the ID's property to filter it out of playlist tracks. So hopefully that word filter stood out to you as something that we can use. We can use the filter method. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this line from line 21 just to get our array of tracks in our playlist. Then I'm going to set tracks. So again, this is our array of tracks in our playlist.tracks state. And we'll set it equal to tracks.filter. So we use the filter method. And the filter method is going to look at each item in our array. So I'm just going to call this current track, whatever it's looking at. Current track.id is not equal to track.id, then it will be included in our tracks array. So what this means is if we are trying to remove a track with an ID of 4, we're going to look through our playlist tracks array, and we're going to look at each item, and if that item's ID is not equal to the track that we clicked on, its ID, so if it's true that they're not equal, then it will go into our tracks array. However, if the current track ID, as we're going through our array, is equal to the track ID that was clicked on, then that makes this a false statement, and it will be filtered out. So now we can just set the state again. This dot set state, and we'll pass in an object playlist tracks to the value of tracks. And this will be our playlist tracks array, which has filtered out our track that matches the item that the user had clicked on to remove. So let's mark step 49 as complete and move on to step 50. In our app constructor method, we want to bind the current value of this to remove track, and then we're going to pass remove track to the playlist component as an onRemove attribute. So in our constructor method, we'll say this dot remove track is equal to this dot remove track dot bind this. Okay, so now we want to find our playlist component, and we want to pass in our remove track method that we created to the onRemove attribute, to an onRemove attribute, this dot remove track. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and save my code and head to the web app and make sure that we've passed this down as we would expect. Okay, our playlist component has the onRemove prop, which is bound to our remove track method that we created. Okay, let's mark step 50 as complete. And we'll move on to step 51. We want to pass onRemove down one more layer of components from the playlist component to the tracklist component. And also we want to pass isRemoval with the value of true down to tracklist. So we'll go to our playlist component, and then within our tracklist component, we're going to have an attribute onRemove. We're going to set this equal to this dot props dot onRemove. And then also we're going to pass a isRemoval set equal to true. Okay, so let's go ahead and save our code and make sure we're passing this down correctly. We have our app to our playlist to our track list. IsRemoval is true. OnRemove prop is bound to remove track method. So we'll mark step 51 as complete. We're going to pass onRemove and isRemoval from the track list component to the track component. So we'll find tracklist.js. And then within our track component, we're going to add an attribute onRemove and set it equal to this dot props dot onRemove. And then finally, we'll pass in isRemoval equal to this dot props dot isRemoval, which is a value of true. So let's make sure this has been passed down correctly. From app to playlist to track list to track. IsRemoval is set to true. OnRemove is bound to remove track method. So now if we scroll down, we actually see that we have this negative symbol that we're looking for, because isRemove is set to true. And if we look in track, that was one of our conditions. If this.props.isRemoval is true, then we're going to have a button with the minus symbol. Okay, let's mark step 52 as complete and move on to step 53. We're going to create a remove track method in the track component, and we're going to use it to remove this.props.track from the playlist. So let's create our method, remove track, and we're simply going to call this.props.onRemove. Remember, this is the method that we created that we use the filter method on. If the ID of the item that we click to remove matches the ID of an item in our playlist array, then it will be filtered out. So say this.props.track. So that's the item that we're passing into our onRemove method. So we can mark step 53 as complete, and step 54, in our track.js file, we're going to bind this.removeTrack to the current value of this in the constructor method. So in our constructor method, we'll say this.removeTrack is equal to this.removeTrack.bind this. Now for our last step, we'll mark step 54 as done, and step 55 in the track.js minus element, our button with the minus sign, we're going to add an onClick property with the value set to this.removeTrack method. So here's our button with the minus sign. And so whenever there's a click, we're going to call this.removeTrack. And let's head back to our page. So now if we look in our React Dev Tools, what we want to make sure that we're able to accomplish that when we click the minus sign, a track is removed. So currently the state is being stored here in our app component. Playlist track represents these three tracks. So album playlist 3, artist 3, and name playlist name 3, all right here. If we click the minus sign, this should disappear from our state. And it does. We no longer see it. It's being filtered out by its ID. All right, great job. Let's go ahead and mark step 55 as complete, and we'll move on to the next section. Okay, so in this section, we're going to work on changing the name of a playlist. In step 56, we can read that in this section, we're going to implement code that allows a learner to change the name of their playlist and save the updated value to the app component state. So if we take a look at our app, we can see that in our app component, we have a state of playlist name. We're going to allow a user to change the name of their playlist. And what will happen is we will see the state for playlist name change. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started on this section. In step 57, in app.js, create a method called updatePlaylistName with the following functionality. It's going to accept a name argument, and it sets the state of the playlist name to the input argument. So we'll go to our app.js file, and we're going to create a method called updatePlaylistName. And this is supposed to accept an argument of name, and it sets the state of the playlist name to the input argument. So we'll say this.setState, and then we'll pass in our object, and we want to change the state of our playlist name to the value of name that's passed in. So this should update in our state our playlist name. Okay, so we can mark step 57 as complete and move on to step 58. In the app constructor method, we're going to bind this to the update playlist name, and then we're going to pass update playlist name to the playlist component as an attribute named onChange. Let's walk through those actions together. In our constructor, in our app.js file, we're going to say this.updatePlaylistName, and we'll set it equal to this.updatePlaylistName.bind, and then we'll pass in this. And then our next step is we want to go ahead and pass our updatePlaylistName method to the playlist component as an attribute named onNameChange. So onNameChange. name change, and we'll set this equal to this dot update playlist name. Okay, so let's go ahead and make sure we've passed down that method as we would expect. In our app component, we passed a playlist, that attribute on name change bound to our method update playlist name that we created. All right, great job. Let's mark step 58 as complete, and we'll move on to step 59. In the playlist component, create a method called handle name change. This method should accept an event that is triggered by an onChange attribute in the playlist component's input element. And then inside of the method, we're going to call onNameChange with the event target's value from the input element. Okay, let's go ahead and break this down together in our code. We want to head to our playlist.js file where we passed our update playlist name method as an attribute named onNameChange. So the first thing we're going to do in our playlist.js file is we're going to create a method called handle name change, and we'll pass in an event. And so we want to call our method that we created, so we can do that with this.props.onNameChange, as we now have access to this onNameChange attribute and the method we passed to it. And we're going to pass in event.target.value. And then on our input, we're going to add an onChange attribute, and we'll set this equal to our this.handleNameChange. So in our input tag, whenever a user begins to type, this handleNameChange method fires, and we've passed in the event, and the event has properties we'll access with dot notation. So event.target.value is going to give us access to the keys that the user is typing, and we pass that in to our onNameChange prop, and that method that we created that's sitting in our app.js file is going to update the state of our playlist name. But there's still one more step we need to take. We need to make a constructor function, and we'll pass in props, then we'll call super props, and we want to bind our handle name change method. And you probably already saw this, but I missed the E in handle on line 14, and also the E here on line 22. So this dot handle name change, this dot handle name change dot bind, and we'll pass in this. Okay, so let's go ahead and save our code and see if this works. Okay, so if we've done this correctly, we see our state in our app component. We see our state for playlist name is set to my playlist. The reason we see new playlist showing up right here is because if we go to our app.js file and we look at playlist, we have a default value of new playlist. That's why that's showing up by default. However, once we start to type, we should be able to update our state. So I'm going to type in newest playlist. And we can see that in our state, our playlist name has been updated with newest playlist. All right, let's go ahead and mark step 59 as complete. And also at the same time, we'll mark step 60 as complete, along with step 61. In step 60, we just added the constructor to the playlist component and called superprops, as we've been doing in our other components as we've been adding methods. And we made sure to bind the current value of this to handle name change. And then in step 61, in the render method, we passed handle name change to the onChange property to our input component in our playlist.js file. All right, great job in that section. Now in our next section, we're going to create a method that saves the playlist to a user's account. This is a pretty long descriptive text here in step 62. Basically, we're going to create a method that will save a user's playlist to their Spotify account and resets the state of the playlist name and tracks array. So to accomplish this goal, you're going to need to access the track property named URI. So I'm going to open up that link, and I'm going to do a quick check for URI. And we can see that the resource, Spotify URI, is a parameter. For the description, the resource identifier that you can enter, for example, in the Spotify desktop client search box to locate an artist, album, or track. To find a Spotify URI, right-click on Windows or control-click on a Mac on the artist or album's or track's name. And the example you'll see is something like this, where it says Spotify, track, and then we have a combination of numbers and letters. So for example, if we brought up Spotify, we could right-click on a song, and then go to Share, and you'll see Copy Spotify URI. So then you can take that, and then if you just want to go to your text editor, you can actually do a paste, and we'll delete this in a moment, but you can see that we do grab the information that we need that way. So this confirms what the URI property looks like. I'm going to go ahead and delete that as we don't need that anymore. So Spotify uses this field to reference tracks in the Spotify library. So we're going to create an array containing the URI of each track in the playlist tracks property. So in our hard-coded playlist, we had objects with properties of name, song, artist, and ID. Ultimately, we need to use the Spotify URI property as well. In a later section, we're going to pass the playlist name and the array of URIs to the Spotify linked method that writes the tracks in the playlist tracks to a user's account. Okay, so let's start implementing this in step 63. In app.js, we're going to create a method called savePlaylist with the following functionality. It generates an array of URI values called track URIs from the playlist tracks property. And then in a later step, we're going to pass the track URIs array and playlist name to a method that will save the user's playlist to their account. In our app.js file, we're going to create a method called savePlaylist. It's not going to take any arguments, and it generates an array of URI values called track URIs from the playlist tracks property. So here's one way we can do this. I'm going to create a variable, const track URIs, as we saw in the step instructions, and we want this to be an array of URI values from the playlist tracks property. And again, our playlist tracks don't have URI properties yet, but they will eventually. So what we can do is we can say this.state.playlistTracks, and then we want to map over that array of objects, and we'll call each object a track as we've done before, and we simply want the URI property value. And that's it for now. In a later step, we're going to pass the track URIs array and playlist name to a method that will save the user's playlist to their account. So let's mark step 63 as complete, and we'll move on to step 64. This should be familiar. We're going to bind the current value of this to our savePlaylist method. Then we're going to pass savePlaylist to the playlist component as an attribute called onSave. So let's go ahead and do that together. We'll go to our constructor function. Let's say this.savePlaylist, and we'll set it equal to this.savePlaylist.bind, and we'll pass in this. And then we want to pass savePlaylist to the playlist component. So let's find our playlist component, and we're going to pass this in as an attribute called onSave. So let's set this equal to this.savePlaylist. All right, let's make sure that we've passed that down correctly. We'll go to our playlist component, and we can see that we have an attribute onSave bound to our savePlaylist method. Perfect. Let's mark step 64 as complete, and in step 65, in the playlist.js file, the Save to Spotify button element, we're going to add an onClick property with the value set to this.props.onSave. So we'll go to playlist, and we're going to find our button, Save to Spotify, and we want an onClick property. So whenever someone clicks on this button, we want this.props.onSave. We want to call that method. And then just to make sure that that's working as we expect, I'm going to go to app.js, and I'm going to go to our savePlaylist method, and I'm going to do an alert and say this method is linked to the button correctly. So now if I click Save to Spotify, the alert goes off just as I would expect, which means we've passed down this method and accessed it exactly as we should. I'm going to click OK and go back to our code, and I'm going to remove this alert. Again, just as you're building an app, it's really helpful to constantly check and make sure that your code is working. That way you don't get too far along and find out that you've made some sort of mistake. Alright, well, mark step 65 is complete, Great job in this section, and we'll move on to the next section where we hook up search bar to Spotify search. In step 66, we get our instructions for this section. We're going to create a method that updates the search results parameter in the app component with a user's search results. So if we look in our app.js, we've hard-coded this.state.search results with an array with 3 objects. This is the current state of our app. In this section, we're going to work on writing the logic that allows a user to enter a search parameter, receive a response from the Spotify API, and update the search results state with the results from a Spotify request. And then in a later section, we're going to hook up the search method to the Spotify API. So let's go ahead and start to implement this. In step 67, in app.js, we're going to create a method called search with the following functionality. It's going to accept a search term, what someone types into the input, and it's going to log the term to the console. And then in a later assessment, we'll hook this method up to the Spotify API. So let's get started. We'll go to our app.js file, and we're going to create a method called search. For an argument, we're going to accept a search term. I'll just go ahead and call this term. And then for now, it's just going to log the term to the console. So console.log term. Then in a later step, we're going to hook up this method to the Spotify API. So let's mark step 67 as complete, and we'll move on to step 68. In the app constructor method, we're going to do something familiar. We're going to bind this to the search method, and then in a later assessment, we'll use this in search. Then following that, we're going to pass our search method to the search bar component as an onSearch attribute. So let's go to our constructor in app.js. We'll say this.search is equal to this.search.bind. We'll pass in this. And then we want to pass this into our search bar component. We'll do this as an attribute on search and set it equal to this.search. All right, let's make sure that we pass that down correctly. We can go to our app and we'll click on search bar and we can see our prop on search bound to our search method. Perfect. All right, step 68 is complete. Let's move on to step 69. In searchbar.js, we're going to create a method called search that passes the state of the term to this.props.onSearch. So in searchbar.js, we're going to create our method. This will be just above the render method, and we'll also call this search, and it'll pass the state of the term to this.props.onSearch. So this.props.onSearch, which onSearch is the prop that we pass to this component, and we're going to pass in this.state.term. So we can mark step 69 as complete. And then in step 70, in our search bar component, we're going to create a constructor method with a call to superprops. And then inside of that constructor, we're going to bind the value of this to search. So in searchbar.js, create a constructor function. And we'll pass in props. And we'll call superprops. And we'll say this.search equals this.search.bind. We'll pass in this. All right, we'll mark step 70 as complete and look at step 71. In searchbar.js, we're going to create a method called handleTermSearch with the following functionality. It's going to accept an event argument, and it's going to set the state of the search bar's term to the event target's value. So let's go ahead and build this out together. We're in our searchbar.js file, and we're going to create a method called handleTermChange. It's going to accept an event as our argument, and then we want to set the state of the search bar's term to the event target's value. So we can do that by saying this.setState, and then we pass in our object, and we want term to be set to our event object that we're passing in, and then the target property, and then we want to get the value. Perfect. Okay, so step 71 is complete. Now in the constructor method, we want to bind the current value of this to this.handleTermChange. We've done this a number of times before. This.handleTermChange is set equal to this.handleTermChange.bind this. Perfect. Step 72 is complete. Now let's look at step 73. In the search bar's input element, add the onChange attribute and set it equal to this.handleTermChange. So in our same JS file, we're going to go down to our input element, and we're going to add an onChange attribute. And so whenever someone starts to type in our input element, this event is going to fire, and we'll set this equal to this.handleTermChange. Remember, handleTermChange is going to be passed an event object, so we're going to have access to whatever is in that input field, and specifically we're going to get the value, the equivalent of the key that's typed in, and we're going to set our state of our term to what that value is. And one thing to note real quick, in step 71, when we created a method called handleTermChange, we wanted it to be able to set the state of the search bar's term to the event target's value. So we need to add some state for this component. So back in searchbar.js, we'll set this.state equal to an object, and we have our property term, and we'll set it to an empty string. This way, this state will be updated as the user provides input into the input element. Okay, let's take a look at our app. Click on our search bar component. The state of term is an empty string. So if we start to type a name, James Taylor, we can see that the state of our property term is being updated with what the user is providing in the input tag. All right, great job. Now let's go ahead and mark 73 as complete as well. All right, great job in this section. In our next section, we're going to work on obtaining a Spotify access token. In the next few sections, we're going to write 3 methods that will accomplish the following. We're going to get a Spotify user's access token, we're going to send a search request to the Spotify API, and we're going to save a user's playlist to the Spotify account. So if there's a place where you might have struggled in getting your app up and going, it might have been in this area of connecting to the Spotify API and dealing with access tokens. So this is something we can go ahead and build out together if you struggled with anything. So before you begin, you're going to need to create an empty JavaScript module called Spotify located in your source folder, a util folder or directory if you haven't done that yet, and then we'll add a spotify.js file. In this assessment, you're going to register a Spotify application and create a method called getAccessToken in the Spotify module. The method will get a user's access token so that they can make requests to the Spotify API. So to accomplish this, you're going to need to use the Spotify application's registration flow and the Spotify authentication guide to help you write the method. So let's start with step 75. Within the source directory, we're going to create a util directory and add a file called spotify.js. I'll mark that as done as we'll do that together with our next step in step 76. In our spotify.js file that we're going to create a Spotify module as an empty object. And then at the bottom of our Spotify.js file, we're going to export Spotify. So let's go ahead and do that together. In our source folder, we're going to create a directory called util. Then in the util directory, we're going to create a file called spotify.js. And then in Spotify.js, we're going to create a Spotify module. So we can do that simply by saying const Spotify and set it equal to an empty object. And then we want to make sure to export. And then we want to make sure to export this module at the end. Export default Spotify. Perfect. Let's mark step 76 as complete, and we'll move on to step 77. Above the empty object, we're going to declare an empty variable that will hold the user's access token. So we'll just say let access token. So we've declared an empty variable that's going to hold the user's access token. In step 78, inside of this Spotify module, we're going to create a method called getAccessToken. The first thing we're going to do is have a check. If the user's access token is already set, we don't want to do anything else. So we'll just return the value saved to the access token. So we'll create our method get access token. And we're going to check. If there's already an access token, then we're simply going to return the access token. No further work will be needed for this method. So we'll mark step 78 as complete and move on to step 79. If the access token is not already set, then we're going to check the URL to see if it has just been obtained. So this is where we're going to use the implicit grant flow to set up a user's account and make request. The implicit grant flow returns a user's access token in the URL. So that's where we'll be able to look for this. Now we're going to look at this guide in a moment to determine how to parse the URL and set values for the access token and expiration time. Let's go ahead and look at the hint together for help with parsing the URL. In the implicit grant flow, values for the access token and expiration time are in the URL parameter after authentication. So this is where we can use window.location.href and the match method to retrieve the access token and expiration time from the URL. We have an example URL from the Spotify API. We can see this access token property, and it's set to a token. And then also we want to look for this expires in parameter as well. And we'll use the match method on the URL string and provide the regular expressions below as inputs. So we'll look for this match using regex to get the access token, and then we'll get our expires in parameter by using this regex as well inside of the match method. So I'm going to go ahead and close up this hint, and I'm going to click on this link to implicit grant flow. And so implicit grant flow is for clients that are implemented entirely using JavaScript and running in the resource owner's browser. We don't need any server-side code to accomplish this. So here's what we do. We direct the user to the Spotify account service, and this is what we get, the access token. So below is the flow that you can look through and read through on your own. So with that, let's start to implement this step together. So if the access token has not already been set, we're going to check the URL to see if it has just been obtained. So let's first check for an access token match. So I'm going to go ahead and declare a variable access token. And then remember from our hint, we can call window.location.href. And if you aren't quite sure on how window location href works, I'm going to go ahead and just copy this code. And I'm going to go to our web app. And I'm going to go to the console and type this in. And we can see that it lets us know that the URL to get to the location that we're currently at is this localhost 3000. So you can go to any website and type in window.location.href, and you're going to get the URL for that page. So what we want to do, if you remember the hint, is we want to use the match method. And then we want to use a regular expression to access the access token. So say access token. And this regex is a bit complex. It might not be something that you've had a lot of experience with, but it'll let us capture all the characters assigned to the access token. And then we also want another variable to capture when our token expires. So I'm going to create a variable called const expires in match, and we'll set this equal to window.location.href. We're going to continue to look at the URL, and we'll use the match method, and we're looking for expires in as the parameter. And then the rest of the content is the same in our regular expression as for our access token. All right, great job on that. Let's make sure that step 79 is marked as complete and move on to step 80. If the access token and expiration time are in the URL, we're going to implement the following steps. We're going to set the access token value. We're going to set a variable for the expiration time. We're going to set the access token to expire at the value for the expiration time. And then we're going to clear the parameter from the URL so the app doesn't try grabbing the access token after it has expired. And the hint below contains code that wipes the access token and URL parameters. We'll take a look at this when it becomes necessary to implement. So back to our Spotify.js file. The next thing we want to ask is if access token match, and I'm going to go ahead and change this variable from access token to access token match, because that's actually what we're looking for, and expires in match. So if both of those exist in the URL, which currently, if we go to our web app as it is, those values are not in our URL. We're just at localhost 3000. But if they are, we want to set the access token value. So access token is equal to access token match at an index of 1. And then we want to set a variable for expiration time, const, and we'll call this expires in. And we're going to need this to be a number for how we're going to use it in a moment. So we'll use this number method available to us in JavaScript, and we'll pass into it expires in match. So this is what we get from the URL. And again, we'll access this at index 1. And then our next step is we want to clear the parameters from the URL so the app doesn't try grabbing the access token after it's expired. So let's return to our hint. We can use window.setTimeout, and we're going to pass in a method. We'll set access token to an empty string, and then we'll set our value of expires in times 1000 milliseconds, or 1 second. A method available to window.history called pushState, and we're going to pass in the string access token, a value of null, and a string with a / for the root of our app. So let's go ahead and implement this together. Just going to add this comment. This is going to clear the parameters and allow us to grab a new access token. So window.setTimeout method, and we'll pass in an arrow function. And we'll do this all in one line so we don't need the opening and closing curly braces. And we'll set access token to an empty string and expires in times 1000 milliseconds. And then we'll use window.history.pushState. We'll pass in access token, null, and then a / string. And then finally, we just want to return the access token. Okay, let's go ahead and mark step 80 as complete, and we'll move on to step 81. The third condition is that the access token variable is empty and not in the URL. Before you write this conditional code block, you need to register your application using the Spotify applications registration flow. You want to give your application a relevant name and description, and also add the following redirect URI. This is something that I've already done, but I'll walk through it with you. We'll just click on Login. And I've already created one called React Jamma Jam. I'll go ahead and click on a new Create an App, and I'll go ahead and call mine React Jamma Jam 2. You can call yours whatever you'd like. And I'm just going to put this as an educational app that will allow users to save songs to a playlist. And you can check any of these items that apply. I'm just going to click Website and choose Next. No, we are not going to monetize this. Then I'm going to click Yes to all these boxes. And then pay specific attention to this client ID. We're going to need this in a moment. But there's one other step you'll need to take. Go to Edit Settings, and we want Redirect URIs. So you want to make sure that you put in HTTP / localhost 3000. And then you can click Add, and you're all set. Okay, so back to step 81. Our third condition is that the access token variable is empty and not in the URL. Okay, so let's mark step 81 as complete. And in step 82, at the top of our Spotify.js file, we're going to create a constant variable for your application's client ID and redirect URI. we're going to set the client ID variable to the value provided on your application page and set the redirect URI to this HTTP localhost 3000. We'll create a const client ID, and we want to make sure that this is in a string. Now you want to make sure that you're not putting any of your API information up on GitHub. I'm leaving mine visible because after I create this app, I'm going to go ahead and remove this app from my Spotify account, so I don't worry about anyone taking advantage of this. Just make sure that if you ever do use specific API information, that you don't expose that content publicly for others to use. So after our const client ID, we're going to go ahead and create another const redirect URI. And we're going to set this equal to our HTTP / localhost 3000. All right, so let's go ahead and mark step 82 as complete, and we'll move on to step 83. So back in our conditional statement, if we don't have the access token match and the expires in match, then we want to redirect users to the following URL. Notice that this client ID and redirect URI, where you should interpolate your variables, client ID and redirect ID. So we'll say else, and the way I'll go ahead and do this is I'm going to create a constant access URL, and because we're going to interpolate variables, I'll use the backticks, and then we want to change client ID to actually use our variable. So we'll do that with $, curly braces, and then the name of my variable was client ID, so I'm just going to copy that so I don't make any typing mistakes. And then redirect URI. Again, we'll go ahead and take advantage of our variable, and I'm going to copy my variable name, redirect URI, and paste that in. And then we want to set window.location equal to access URL. Awesome. All right, let's mark step 83 as complete, and we're all finished up with this section. In our next section, we're going to implement Spotify search request. So in step 84, we're given our instructions for this section. We're going to create a method in Spotify.js that accepts a search term input, passes the search term value to the Spotify request, then returns that response as a list of tracks in JSON format. So we're going to need the user's access token to make requests to the Spotify API, and we're going to use the request parameters in step 4 of the implicit grant flow design. We'll take a look at that as we go through this section to make requests. In the following steps, we're going to use the fetch method to make our requests, but any method will do. And we want to be sure to use the v1 search type equals track endpoint to make our request. And we'll use the Spotify web API endpoint reference to help format our request. Okay, so let's get started with implementing this. In step 85, in the Spotify object, we're going to add a method called search. This will accept a parameter for the user's search term, and then the search method will return a promise that will eventually resolve to the list of tracks from the search. Let's get started. So we're going to add another method after our getAccessToken method that we created earlier, and we're going to call this search, and it's going to take our term for an argument. Okay, let's mark step 85 as complete, and in step 86 we'll start to build out the content within our search method. We'll start a promise chain by returning a GET request using the fetch method, as we mentioned, to the following Spotify endpoint, and we'll replace the value of term with the value saved to the search term argument, and we'll add an authorization header to the request containing the access token. We will need to make sure that we have an access token, so I'm going to go ahead and create a const access token, and we'll set that equal to our getAccessToken that we just created. So Spotify.getAccessToken. So now we should have access to our token when we are doing our search. Now we're going to go ahead and use the fetch method for the endpoint listed in step 86. So we'll return fetch, and I'm going to use backticks, and then we'll paste in this endpoint. And remember, we want term to be our variable. So we'll use $, curly brace, and this will pass in our term. Now the next thing we want to do is add an authorization header to the request containing the access data. So we'll do that by adding a second argument to our fetch of an object with the property of headers, and headers will be set to an object with the property of authorization, and we'll go ahead and use backticks because we're going to want to use our access token. We'll have bearer, dollar, curly braces, and we'll pass in our access token. And I just cleaned up the format a little bit to make this more human readable. So now let's go ahead and mark step 86 as complete, and we'll move on to step 87. First, we're going to convert the returned response to JSON, and then we're going to map the converted JSON to an array of tracks. We want to check if the JSON doesn't contain any tracks, then we want to return an empty array. And the mapped array should contain a list of track objects with the following properties: ID, name, artist, and album, with an addition of the URI. We didn't have this property in our app.js file where we set the state for search result tracks. Let's get started with implementing this. First, let's convert the response to JSON when our promise is fulfilled. So we'll say .then. We'll take the response and then a fat arrow function, and we'll return response.json. And this will convert our response to JSON, JavaScript object notation. After that happens, then we want to do the following. With our JSON response, when our response has been converted to JSON, we want to take that content, and we'll do a fat arrow function. And we're first going to check if JSON response .tracks is false. If there's no tracks that exist, then we simply want to return an empty array. However, if there is a response, then we want to return a mapped array containing a list of track objects with their properties ID, name, artist, album, and URI. So we can do that by saying return JSON response .tracks .items .map. And so as we're looping through our array, we'll call each item track, and we're going to return ID set to track ID, track.id. Name will be set to track.name. Artist will be set to track.artist at index of 0. .name. Album will be set to track.album.name, and URI will be set to track.URI. Alright, perfect. Let's make sure to mark step 87 is complete, and we'll move on to step 88. In our app.js file, we're going to import Spotify and update the search method with the Spotify search method. And then we'll update the state of search results with the value resolved from the Spotify.search method's promise. So we'll head to our app.js file, and we want to go ahead and import in Spotify. So import Spotify from, and we're going to go up 2 directories to our util directory, and then get our Spotify.js file that we created. And now we're going to go ahead and go to our search method, and we will remove this console.log, and we're going to update it with our Spotify search method. So Spotify.search, and then we pass in the term. Because remember, in our Spotify file, our search method is looking for a term to work with. It's going to be in our endpoint that we're hitting. So back in our app.js file, we next want to update the state of search results with the value resolved from our Spotify.search's promise. So we'll say .then, I'll say search results, and we'll set this .set state, and we'll pass in our object, search results. Search results will be set to the value of search results as returned from our promise. So this .state.search results will now be set to the value resolved from our Spotify search's promise. So let's save our code. Okay, so let's go ahead and mark step 88 as complete. Alright, great job in this section. Let's go ahead and move on to our next section where we implement how to save a user's playlist. We're going to create a method called savePlaylist. This is going to write the learner's custom playlist in jamming to their Spotify account. The savePlaylist method accepts a playlist name and an array of track URIs. And it's going to make the following 3 requests to the Spotify API. We're going to get the current user's ID. We're going to post a new playlist with the input name of the current user's Spotify account, which will receive the playlist ID back from the request. Finally, we're going to post the track URIs to the newly created playlist, referencing the current user's account with their ID and the new playlist ID. And we will update the savePlaylist method in app.js to use the new Spotify.savePlaylist method that we create. So let's start to implement this in step 90. We're going to create a method in Spotify.js that accepts 2 arguments. The first argument is the name of the playlist. The second is an array of track URIs. Inside the function, we're going to check if there are values saved to the method's 2 arguments. If not, we'll just return. So we'll begin with our Spotify.js file, and after our search method that we just created, we're now going to make a new method called savePlaylist. And we'll pass in arguments of name and track URIs. And remember, the first thing we want to do is we want to check if there's no name or there are no track URIs. So if this array is empty, then we're simply just going to return. So that was step 90 completed. Now in step 91, we're going to create 3 default variables. An access token variable set to the current user's access token, a headers variable with an authorization parameter containing the user's access token in the implicit grant flow request format, and an empty variable for the user's ID. So we can go ahead and do that by creating a const access token. And the handy thing about creating our getAccessToken method that we did earlier is that we can use this again and again. So we can just call Spotify.getAccessToken, and then we'll declare a variable headers. And just like we did in our previous method, we can set headers to an object, the property of authorization, and then we can pass in our variable by using backticks, bearer, $, curly braces, access token. Perfect. And then finally, we'll declare a user ID. So in line 53, we have an access token variable set to the current user's access token. In our following line, we have a headers variable set to an object with the authorization parameter containing a user's access token. And then finally, we have an empty variable for the user's ID. Perfect. Let's mark step 91 as complete, and we'll move on to step 92. We want to make a request that returns the user's Spotify username. And we're going to convert that response to JSON and save the response ID parameter to the user's ID variable. So let's take a look at the hint how we might do this. If we make a request to the following Spotify endpoint, we must pass a second argument with the object containing the headers object, which we can see below. Okay, so let's go ahead and do this together. We're going to return, and we'll use the fetch method. This will allow us to take advantage of promises. And we want the endpoint that was in our hint, and we'll make sure that this is a string. Perfect. And the second argument is going to be an object with headers set to our headers object. All right, perfect. Okay. Then the next thing we want to do is we want to convert the response to JSON and save the response ID parameter to the user's ID variable. So I'm going to format this a little bit. And we're using a .then. For this promise, when this is returned, we want to convert the response to JSON with response.json. And then we want to save the response ID parameter to the user's ID variable. So we can do this by saying then JSON response, and we'll do a fat arrow function. So we'll set user ID equal to JSON response dot ID. So in step 92, we converted the response to JSON and saved the response ID parameter to the user's ID variable. Perfect. Okay, so in step 93, we're going to use the returned user ID to make a post request that creates a new playlist in the user's account and returns a playlist ID. And we can use Spotify's playlist endpoints to find a request that creates a new playlist. We'll set the playlist name to the value passed into the method. We'll convert the response to JSON and save the response ID parameter to a variable called playlist ID. We'll return fetch. Then we're going to use backticks as we hit this endpoint because we're passing in our user ID variable that we set to JSON response.id. So our second argument is going to be an object where we set headers to our headers variable. Our method is a post method, and we want to set the playlist name to the value passed into the method. So this means for our body, JSON.stringify, and we'll pass in this object name will be set to name. Remember, this is being passed in above. So finally, we're going to convert the response to JSON and save the response ID parameter to a variable called playlist ID. So when this promise has been fulfilled, then we're going to convert the response to JSON, response.json. When that promise has been fulfilled, then we want to take JSON response and create a variable called const playlist ID and set it equal to JSON response.id. Alright, so we've made a fetch to this endpoint and we've passed in the user ID. We've also passed in an object with property of headers set to our headers, method set to post, and body set to the name that the user has created for their playlist. We then convert the response to JSON, and then from that JSON response, we create a variable called playlist ID and set it equal to JSON response.id. Perfect, let's make sure that step 93 is marked as complete and move on to step 94. We're going to use the returned user ID to make a post request that creates a new playlist in the user's account and returns a playlist ID. Again, we can go ahead and use the Spotify playlist endpoints to find a request that adds tracks to a playlist. We'll then set the URI's parameter to an array of track URIs passed into the method. And then finally, we'll convert the response to JSON and save the response ID parameter to a variable called playlist ID. And if you need any help with that endpoint, you can just go to the hint for step 94, and we have the endpoint right here that you're going to need. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that. And let's get to work implementing. When this promise has been fulfilled, so we're going to return a fetch. Then we're going to pass in that endpoint that's in the hint. And we want to make sure that we have the base added on as well. And I'm going to put this within backticks because we have our two variables, our user ID that we got from our JSON response ID. And then we also have our playlist ID that we got from this JSON response.id just above us. Then our second argument is going to be an object with headers, once again, set to headers, method, set to post, and then finally body will be set to json.stringify, and we'll pass in an object where URIs is set to track URIs. And we'll mark step 94 as complete. Now on to step 95. In app.js, we're going to update the save playlist method to call spotify.savePlaylist, And after we call Spotify.SavePlaylist, we're going to reset the state of playlist name to new playlist and playlist tracks to an empty array. So let's go ahead and do that together. We'll head to app.js, and underneath our const for track URIs, we'll call our Spotify.SavePlaylist method that we just created, and we'll pass in this.state.playlist name, and then we'll pass in track URIs. And so after this method has been called and the promise is fulfilled, then we're going to pass in an empty arrow function. And we'll say this dot set state, and we'll pass in an object where playlist name will now be set to new playlist, and playlist tracks will be set to an empty array. So this is after we've saved our playlist. We're now setting our new state just to be a generic new playlist and for playlist tracks to be empty. Okay, and so now that we have that work done, let's make sure in our app.js to clean up our initial state. We no longer need these hard-coded objects within our array. So we'll save that because we don't want any search results until someone has actually searched. And also playlist tracks. We don't want any playlist tracks to already be on the right-hand side of the screen. We want them to appear after a user has chosen on the search results that they actually want to add to a playlist. So we'll save the results. And now if we preview our page, we'll see that results are empty and new playlist is empty. I'll type in James Taylor. And when I do, we have our results. I'll add a couple to this James Taylor greatest hits and save to Spotify. All right, great job. So let's go ahead and mark step 95 as complete. So we finally finished building out our app. Currently, this app has the same functionality as the jamming app that you can access by clicking on this jamming link at the very top of our project. Now, chances are you might find a lot of ways to improve the user experience. I'd encourage you to take everything that we've learned about React and components and actions and try to find some things that you can touch up, or possibly maybe even some features that you can add. Great job in building this app. In the final section, we're going to look at how to deploy our app to the web for others to use. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at the final step of deploying our app. In this section, we're going to use Surge to deploy your jamming project. We'll start by installing Surge globally. Alright, so we can mark step 96 as complete. And then step 97, before we deploy, you want to think of a domain name with the following format. Some name, which is going to be what you choose. This can be replaced with anything that you like. .surge.sh. You can just type in Surge. And if you haven't created an account yet, it will prompt you to create one. Project is already filled out for you, so you can just press enter. Then for domain, they've offered a suggestion of strangeband.surge.sh. I'll go ahead and just go with that. And we have a status bar letting us know how long till our upload is completed. Perfect. Now we have a URL that we can go to. But before we do that, we'll have to follow a couple more steps in step 97. In our Spotify.js file, we need to set redirect URI to our new domain. And in our Spotify application, we need to add our new domain as the redirect URI. So I'll go here first. And I'm going to find my application. I'm going to go to Edit Settings. And I'm going to remove the localhost 3000 redirect. I'll say http // and then strangeband.surge.sh. And now I want to go to my Spotify.js file and have the redirect go to that location as well. So once I've saved that, we'll go back to the terminal and I'll type in npm run build. This will take an effect to those changes we just made in Spotify.js. And I'm quickly going to mark step 97 and also step 98 done. And our last step is in the command line to type search. And so once you've done npm run build, if you do an ls, you can see that you have a build directory. So go ahead and cd into your build directory. And I went ahead and confirmed that that's where I was at. We'll simply type in search, where we have the location of our project, and make sure that it's the domain that you had previously. And now we have this upload status bar to let us know how long until our app is up and running. All right, I'm going to take that URL and put it in the browser. And there we have it. Our app is live and deployed, and now you can take it and share it with friends directly from their phone and send them right to their Spotify account. Let's go back and mark step 99 as complete. All right, great job. You just deployed a React app that queries the Spotify API. This is Rob with Codecademy. Happy coding.